What would you do if a child asked you to bury their sibling? This isn't hypothetical. This actually happened. And what happened next will challenge everything you think you know about family, love, and second chances. Before we begin, I need to tell you this story gets intense, but it's also one of the most beautiful examples of human compassion I've ever encountered. So stay with me, because by the end, you'll understand why some moments change us forever. Richard Mason was dying inside, even though everyone around him saw success. President of a major tech company, corner office, seven-figure deals, the kind of man other men wanted to be. But here's what they didn't see. He hadn't felt anything real in 3 years, not since his wife Clara died in his arms. Have you ever lost someone so completely that you just shut down? That was Richard. Every morning, 5 a.m., coffee, reports, meetings, more reports. He built a fortress out of his routine because routines don't hurt. Numbers don't grieve. Spreadsheets don't ask you why you couldn't save the person you loved most. That December morning started like every other brutal heat. Another $1 million deal closed. Another day of going through the motions. He walked through the historic district of Recife, past street vendors, past tourists, past hundreds of people just living their lives. He saw them, but he didn't really see them anymore. You know that feeling? When you're so lost in your own pain that the world becomes background noise? That's where Richard was. Until he heard something that pierced through everything, crying, not loud, not dramatic, just broken. The kind of sound that comes from a place too deep for words. Most people would keep walking. He'd walked past 1,000 stories before. But something about this cry grabbed hold of something in him that he thought had died with Clara. He followed the sound into a narrow alley between crumbling buildings. The kind of place most people pretend doesn't exist. And there, at the end of that alley, he found her. A little girl, maybe 8 years old, sitting on the filthy ground with tangled hair falling over her dirt-streaked face, bare feet covered in cuts. But that's not what stopped Richard's heart. In her arms was a baby, 2 years old, maybe less, completely still, pale, lips cracked and dry. The kind of stillness that only means one thing. The contrast was brutal, the suffocating heat of the morning and this cold, lifeless child. The girl looked up, brown eyes swimming with tears, and she said something that would echo in Richard's mind for the rest of his life. "Sir, can you bury my little sister? She didn't wake up today, and she's very cold. I don't have money for a funeral, but I promise I'll work and pay you when I grow up." Let that sink in for a moment. An 8-year-old girl, asking a stranger to bury her sister, promising to pay him back someday. Time stopped. Richard felt like he'd been punched in the chest. The memory of Clara wasting away while he watched helplessly came flooding back. That same crushing helplessness. He looked around for an adult, anyone responsible for these children. But the alley was empty. Just him, this girl, and what he believed was a dead baby. The girl's crying grew softer, like she was trying not to bother him, like she was used to people walking away. Here's the question. What would you do? Would you call someone? Would you keep walking? Would you convince yourself it's not your problem? Richard couldn't move. His legs felt welded to the ground. Every instinct told him to run. Don't get involved. Don't feel this. Don't let anyone else die on your watch. But then something shifted. He realized he couldn't hide anymore. Not from this, not from her. He knelt down. Richard reached out with trembling hands and touched the baby's skin. Cold, like ice, but he didn't give up. He pressed his fingers to her tiny neck, searching for what he knew he wouldn't find. Seconds passed, nothing, and then a pulse. Faint, barely there but present. "She's alive," Richard gasped, his voice cracking. "Your sister is still alive." The girl's eyes went wide, hope and disbelief fighting for space on her face. "Are you sure?" she whispered, clutching the baby tighter. "She hasn't moved since last night. She's so cold." Richard's hands shook as he pulled out his phone. He called the Portuguese hospital, a place he'd been donating to quietly since Clara's death, though he could never bring himself to visit. "Dr. Henrique, this is Richard Mason. Pediatric emergency. Critical condition. I'm bringing her now. Prepare the ICU." He didn't wait for questions. He reached for the baby. "Give me your sister. We need to go. Now." The girl hesitated. Her brown eyes studied this stranger in an expensive suit who appeared from nowhere. She had no reason to trust him, but she had no choice. She handed over the baby, and Richard was shocked by how light she was. Severe malnutrition. This child had been starving. "Come with me," he said firmly but gently. "I won't leave you alone." The girl grabbed a crumpled plastic bag, her only possession, and followed. The drive to the hospital was chaotic. Traffic, horns, red lights at all the wrong times. Every second felt like torture. The girl sobbed in the passenger seat. "I tried, sir," she whispered. "I always fed her first, but she got quieter and quieter. Today, she didn't wake up. I thought she went to heaven to be with our grandmother." Those words cut through Richard like knives. It wasn't just about saving a child anymore. It was about not letting death win again. Not on his watch. When they reached the hospital, the medical team was waiting. Richard handed the baby to the nurses, but he couldn't let go immediately. Not until the doctor said, "We'll take care of her from here." The girl grabbed his hand and held it tight. Her eyes begged him for a silent promise. "Don't leave me." Richard squeezed back. In that moment, everything changed. The bond was sealed, and deep down, he knew there was no going back to his empty routines. If this story is hitting you as hard as it hit me, hit that subscribe button now. What comes next gets even more intense. The hospital doors closed with a heavy thud. The baby disappeared down the corridor, surrounded by doctors shouting medical terms. Richard didn't understand. He stood in the lobby, breathless. The girl who finally told him her name was Leah clung to his hand like letting go meant abandonment. A doctor emerged. Grave expression. "Her condition is critical, but there's still a chance. Severe malnutrition, advanced pneumonia. We need to act fast." It wasn't enough to have found her alive. Now the real battle began. Then a social worker approached. Her badge said Marcia Torres. The irony of that name so close to his dead wife's felt like a punch to the gut. "Are you related to the child?" she asked in that bureaucratic tone that means trouble. "No," Richard replied, "but I'm the one who brought her here." Marcia's eyes narrowed. "Then we'll need your information. This girl can't just leave with a stranger. Child Protection Services will be called." Those words hit him like ice water. For the first time, Richard realized he could lose Leah, that the system could rip her away at any moment. Leah's grip on his hand tightened. She understood, too. The days that followed were brutal. Leah was evaluated by psychologists and nurses, but she refused to leave Richard's side whenever he appeared. She slept in chairs next to him, refused food when he wasn't there. The staff was moved, but they also had questions. Who was this man to earn such trust from a traumatized child? Richard was torn. Every time he looked at Leah, he saw Clara's face in those final days. The child's fragility poked at wounds he thought he'd buried. At night, alone at home, he'd stare at his glass of whiskey without drinking, wondering if he had the strength to do this, to get involved again. What if he lost this girl too? The pressure mounted. Marcia seemed suspicious of his motives. One day, she delivered her verdict. "There are families on the adoption waiting list for years. What you did was noble, but it doesn't give you rights over them." Richard felt rage rising. "I'm not talking about paperwork. I'm talking about a child who needs immediate care. If I hadn't stopped in that alley, she'd already be dead." The argument echoed through the hallways. Leah cowered, afraid everything would collapse. But there were glimmers of hope. One afternoon, Leah pulled something from her plastic bag, a torn, faded photo of an elderly woman smiling. "It's my grandmother," she said, her voice breaking. "She took care of us. After she died, we were alone." Richard held the photo like it was made of glass. That image spoke of roots, of loss, of responsibilities too heavy for small shoulders. The doctor returned at dawn. "The baby survived the first night, still early, but she's responding." Leah burst into tears of relief, grabbing Richard's arm like she wanted to merge with him. It was then that Richard understood. This wasn't just about rescuing two children. It was about rescuing himself from a meaningless life. But the road ahead was far from easy. Investigations, interviews, home visits, reports. Every step would be accompanied by suspicious eyes and formal paperwork. But Richard was already too committed to back down. What would you do in Richard's position? Would you fight the system or let fate decide? Tell me in the comments. The courtroom smelled of old paper and floor wax. The air conditioning was too cold, but Richard was sweating in his dark suit. Every step echoed too loudly. All eyes on him. Leah walked beside him, head down, squeezing his hand so hard she seemed to want to disappear into him. Inside, the silence was oppressive. Long table, judge with an unreadable expression, prosecutor on one side, social worker Marcia on the other. Richard felt the weight of the world on his shoulders. "Mr. Richard Mason," the judge began, "we're here to assess the situation of the minors found under your responsibility." Bureaucratic words followed. Protocols, registrations, adoption queues, reports. But Richard could barely hear. He could only feel Leah's small body trembling beside him. The prosecutor stood. The blow came hard. "Your Honor, we must remember there are hundreds of families waiting years for legal adoption. The defendant is a powerful businessman, but that doesn't place him above the law." The word defendant fell on Richard like a sentence. His instinct was to stand up, fight back, shout that this wasn't about power, it was about lives. But something held him back. Leah's pleading gaze. The judge turned to her. "Miss, can you tell me your name?" "I'm Leah," she said, her voice trembling. "And what do you want to happen now, Leah?" Thick silence filled the room. Leah took a deep breath. Her eyes fixed on the judge, then on Richard. Her voice was low but firm, carrying strength that didn't belong in childhood. "I want to stay with him. He didn't let my sister die. He didn't let me be alone." The room stirred with murmurs. Marcia cleared her throat. "With all due respect, Your Honor, we cannot base a legal decision on the emotional appeals of a traumatized child." That's when Richard exploded. He jumped up, his chair scraping across the floor like thunder. "Traumatized?" His voice came out louder than intended. "This girl is stronger than most adults I know. She cared for her sister on the streets, went hungry so she could feed the baby first, and yet here she stands, asking only not to be torn away from the only person she has left." The judge raised his hand for silence, but Richard didn't back down. "Your Honor, I lost my wife to an illness I couldn't beat. I spent 3 years hiding in reports and meetings because I didn't want to feel the pain of loss again. But when I found Leah and Julia in that alley, I realized I couldn't run anymore. I chose to be here. I chose to fight for them, and I will fight to the end." The room fell silent. The air conditioning seemed louder. Seconds felt longer. Leah cried softly, but without letting go of his hand. The judge rested his arms on the table, looking over his glasses. His voice came slow, drawn out, but with enough weight to cut through the air. "The court recognizes the emotional bond that has been established. Considering the social risk, the evidence of immediate care, and the child's own statement, I grant temporary custody of the minors to Mr. Richard Mason." The words echoed like a snap of liberation. Leah collapsed into his lap, sobbing, clinging to him like she finally believed she was safe. Richard closed his eyes and took a deep breath, feeling hot tears escape despite years of restraint. He knew from that moment on, nothing would ever be the same. If this moment gave you chills, hit that like button now. It shows us you want more powerful stories like this. The courthouse hallway seemed longer on the way out. Richard walked slowly, as if each step weighed a ton. Leah walked hand in hand with him, her small plastic backpack swinging on her shoulder. Her face was still wet with tears, but her eyes reflected something new. It was no longer just fear. It was hope. Timid, almost unbelievable, but there. Outside, the city continued with its usual noise, but for Richard, everything was silent. They got into the car without speaking. Leah leaned her head against the window, eyes half closed, exhausted from the weight of recent days. Richard started the engine but didn't drive off immediately. He sat motionless, hands on the steering wheel, breathing deeply. For the first time in years, there was no meeting waiting, no reports piled on his desk, just the emptiness of not knowing what to do next. "Mr. Richard," Leah's voice broke the silence. He turned. "Yes, dear?" "The judge said I can stay with you now. But what if one day you get tired of me?" The words fell like stones. Richard closed his eyes, trying to hold back emotions. Then he leaned closer, placed his hand on her small shoulder, and spoke softly. "I won't get tired of you. Never." The car drove on. They arrived home at dusk. The mansion's gate opened slowly, revealing the perfectly manicured garden and mirrored windows. For Leah, it was a strange world far from the dusty streets and cold alleys where she'd lived with her sister. She hesitated before entering. Richard noticed and bent to her height. "This is your home now," he said firmly but gently. "You don't need to be afraid." Inside, the silence was different. Too much space, too many white walls, too much expensive furniture. Richard realized that despite all the luxury, his house seemed as empty as he had been before meeting the girls. Leah dropped her plastic backpack in the corner and stood still, looking around like she was in forbidden territory. "Can I really stay here?" she asked. "Yes." Richard smiled even though his eyes were still red. This place never made sense until now. That night, Richard hardly slept. He sat in the armchair in his bedroom, watching the half-open door to the room where Leah had fallen asleep for the first time in a real bed. Her body was curled on its side, as if still expecting the cold of the floor. But her breathing was calm. For the first time since he'd found her, she was sleeping peacefully. Richard leaned his head back and closed his eyes, but memories came flooding back. Clara, fragile in her hospital bed, holding his hand in her last moments. He'd never been able to save her, but now somehow he felt he was being called to a new purpose, to save those who could still be saved. The next morning, he woke before sunrise, made coffee as he always did, but the kitchen didn't seem the same. On the table next to the porcelain cup was a child's drawing on notebook paper, crooked lines forming three figures holding hands, a tall man, a girl with braids, and another smaller girl, all smiling. Richard stood motionless, staring at that drawing like it was a silent contract. When Leah entered the kitchen, rubbing her still sleepy eyes, he held up the paper. "Did you do this?" She nodded shyly. "It's us. You, me, and my sister." Richard's heart tightened. He carefully stored the drawing in a leather folder, filing away the most important document of his life. He knew the days ahead would bring difficulties. Watchful social workers, endless bureaucracy, the fragility of the baby is still recovering. But at that moment, nothing mattered more than the fact that he was not alone. For the first time in a long time, he had someone to call family. If this touched you, now's the time to support our channel. Subscribe if you haven't. And if you're already part of our family, consider leaving a super thanks. It helps us continue bringing stories like this. That morning seemed different from all the others. The sun shone through the mansion's windows no longer as a reminder of emptiness, but as an announcement of life. Children's laughter echoed through the garden, mixed with the sound of the hose Leah was holding, watering plants with enthusiasm that only a free child could have. Julia, now recovered, ran after butterflies, tripping over her own legs but always getting up with a smile. Richard watched from the balcony, a forgotten cup of coffee in his hand. He was no longer the man who woke up early just to review reports. Now the papers rested in piles that could wait. He'd discovered something no million-dollar meeting had ever offered him, the meaning of staying. The house was no longer silent or as organized as before. Toys scattered across the hallway. Drawings stuck to the refrigerator. A teddy bear forgotten on the sofa. Every detail was a reminder that this once cold mansion now breathed. For the first time in years, he wasn't afraid of the silence of night. He knew that behind two doors were light breaths that kept him awake to life. Not everything was simple. Social worker visits continued, papers to fill out, future hearings, daily adjustments. But inside, Richard had already made the decision that changed everything. No matter how difficult, Leah and Julia were his family, and family is not negotiable. One night, sitting on the edge of the bed, he saw Leah enter with timid steps. "Can I ask you something?" she said, holding a blanket. "Of course." Does Daddy," she corrected herself hesitantly, "does Daddy think I'm too much of a burden?" Richard swallowed hard. He knelt in front of her, held her small hands, and replied slowly, "You will never be a burden, Leah. You are the reason this house has light again." She smiled shyly, but her eyes sparkled. At that moment, he realized it wasn't just the girls being rescued. He was too. So what does this story teach us? It shows us something you may have felt at some point in your life. It doesn't take blood for someone to become family. Sometimes a gesture of compassion at the right moment is enough. Sometimes all someone needs is a place where they can simply be. Not all pain can be healed. Not all trauma disappears. But when there is care, when there is presence, even the deepest scars find space to transform into strength. Richard discovered this. Leah discovered this. Maybe you need to hear it too. Love doesn't erase the past, but it's capable of writing new futures. Now I want to speak directly to you who've stayed with me this far. Have you noticed that in some way this story is also about you? Because all of us at some point have been like Richard trying to hide pain behind tasks, numbers, or routines. And all of us at some point have been like Leah just asking not to be left alone. If this story found you today, perhaps it's a reminder that you are not alone. There's always someone who can be touched by your gesture of attention, by your gaze, by your presence. Sometimes you're Richard, other times you're Leah. And that's okay, because the most important thing is not to give up on connecting. Thank you for watching until the end. Stories like this aren't easy to tell, but they matter. They matter because they remind us of what really sustains life. If you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. Be part of this community. And if you already have, consider supporting us with a super thanks. Every gesture strengthens our work and allows us to continue bringing you real stories that touch the soul. Don't stop here. There's another story waiting for you with the same intensity and truth. Maybe it will also find a piece of your heart that needs to be reminded it's not alone. Because in the end, that's what it's all about. Sharing stories that cross borders, reach hearts, and remind us that love, when it's true, is never wasted.